12 heads of state. In one room, 3 translators sweating through their shirts and a single folded piece of paper that none of them had been told about in advance. But the moment that stopped the entire summit was not any of those things. It was a pause, a 4-second silence before the Pope spoke, a silence so complete that a photographer 3 rows back said afterward he could hear his own camera's autofocus motor whirring in the quiet. That is where this begins. The building was not a cathedral. It was a glass-walled conference hall on neutral ground, the kind of building built for trade summits and climate accords, all steel beams and diffused light, chosen specifically because it belonged to no faith and no flag. 12 leaders had been summoned not by threat, not by treaty, but by a letter. A short letter, hand-signed, asking only that they come and listen before they decided anything else. 3 had tried to send deputies. All 3 had been quietly told, through channels nobody could quite trace, back to a name that deputies were welcome to attend, but only the 12 would be permitted to speak. All 12 came in person. Nobody outside that room knew what was coming. The word had already started moving through embassies days earlier, hushed half-joking at first, that the Pope was bringing something to the table nobody had prepared for. Analysts on television speculated about sanctions, about back-channel diplomacy, about a secret document leaked from a rival government. None of them were right. What the Pope carried into that room was smaller than a phone lighter than a coin, and it would end the meeting in under 6 minutes. He arrived not through the front doors where the cameras were arranged in 3 neat rows, but through a side entrance used by kitchen staff. He walked past stacked chairs and a folded catering table, past 2 startled security guards who hadn't been told which door he preferred, and he apologised to both of them by name before he even reached the hallway. One of the guards later told a reporter off the record that the Pope had asked him how his daughter's exam had gone, a detail from a conversation the guard didn't even remember having, weeks earlier with someone he'd only spoken to once. That was the first sign that something about this man's presence didn't operate on the usual rules of power. He remembered people, not staff, not functionaries, people. Inside the hall, the 12 leaders sat in a horseshoe arrangement, a table built for negotiation, not for sermons. He did not take the head seat reserved for him. He took a plain chair at the open end of the horseshoe level with everyone else, and for a moment simply looked around the room without speaking, meeting each set of eyes in turn. Some held his gaze, some did not. "I did not come here to negotiate," he said, and his voice, though quiet, filled the hard-surfaced room without effort. "I came here to return something." He reached into the plain black folder in front of him. Not gold-embossed, not ceremonial, just an ordinary folder, like the ones used in any office anywhere in the world, and drew out a single sheet of paper. He did not read from notes. He unfolded it, once laid it flat on the table, and slid it with 2 fingers to the leader seated nearest him. "This is a copy," he said, of a letter, written 11 years ago by a mother in a refugee camp on a border 3 of you control. She wrote it to no one in particular. She wrote it to whoever might one day read it. It was found stitched into the lining of a coat donated to charity, and it took 11 years to reach me, and when it did, I could not put it down, and I could not look away from what it asked. The room, according to 3 separate accounts given afterward by people who were present, did not move. 12 of the most powerful people on earth sat in total stillness, while an unassuming man in white read a stranger's letter aloud from memory without looking down at the page again, because he had already committed every word of it to memory the night he received it. What he read was not a demand. It was not political. It was a description, a mother describing in plain and unpolished language the sound her child made the last night they slept outdoors, before finding shelter, and the promise she made to that child, and the fact that she had never been able to keep it. He read it the way a father reads a bedtime story to a child who is already half asleep, softly without performance, as if the room itself needed comforting rather than persuading. "I am not here to tell any of you what policy to write," he said when he finished. "I am not a diplomat, and I have no army, and I hold no seat at any council that can bind you to anything. I have only this." He set his hand flat on the paper, a voice that would otherwise never be heard in a room like this one. "That is my only weapon. I do not have another." For a long moment nobody spoke. Then the leader closest to him, a man known publicly for his sharp, unsentimental style of governance, a man who had walked out of 2 prior summits over procedural disagreements, reached across the table, picked up the letter, read it silently to himself, and set it back down with visible care as though it might tear. That was the moment the room changed. Not because of an argument won, because of a silence honoured. To understand why this single sheet of paper mattered as much as it did, and why the phrase secret weapon began circulating in briefing rooms and newsrooms. Within hours, it helps to go back further to understand who this Pope was before he ever stood in that glass hall, and why a folded letter carried more weight in the end than any policy paper any of the 12 had brought with them. He had not been born into influence. Long before the white cassock, he had spent years as a parish priest in a town most maps didn't bother to label a town, where the roads flooded twice a year, and the only working telephone line belonged to the grocer. He had learned in those years a particular discipline that stayed with him for the rest of his life, the discipline of listening first and speaking only once he understood what was actually being asked of him. Parishioners who remembered him from that time described a man who visited the sick without being summoned, who sat for hours with grieving families, and said almost nothing, who once walked 4 hours through mud to bless a dying farmer's field, because the farmer had asked for exactly that and nothing more. He never tried to be impressive. One elderly woman from that parish told a journalist years later, after he had already become one of the most recognised men alive, he tried to be present. There's a difference, and most people in power never learn it. That instinct presence over performance followed him through every stage of a career he never seemed to be chasing. Colleagues from his years overseeing missions in difficult regions described a man who insisted on visiting conflict zones personally rather than receiving reports about them, who once cancelled an official reception to sit instead with a group of children orphaned by a flood, feeding them by hand because the aid workers were short-staffed and he refused to simply observe while others worked. There is a difference, he said once in a homily delivered to a small congregation long before the world was paying attention to his words, between caring about people and being with people. The first can be done from a comfortable distance. The second cannot be done from anywhere but beside them. It's worth slowing down here, because this is the thread that runs underneath everything that followed the summit. The letter, the 6 minutes that reportedly ended a meeting nobody expected to end so quickly. Every account from people who worked closely with him before and after his election returns to the same observation. He treated the smallest, quietest voice in any room as though it were the most important one present. Aides described him rewriting prepared remarks minutes before major addresses, because a single conversation with a stranger, a cleaner in a hotel corridor, a child outside a cathedral, a soldier standing guard at a border crossing, had given him something more honest to say than anything his speechwriters had drafted. And so, when world leaders speculated in private about what leverage the Pope might bring to a summit convened at his own request, they were asking the wrong question entirely. He had no leverage in the traditional sense. No troops, no trade agreements, no sanctions to threaten or lift. What he had was something almost impossible to counter in a room built for strategy, an unwavering, well-documented history of speaking only for those who could not speak for themselves, and doing it with such consistency that even his sharpest critics had never once caught him using that voice for personal gain. That consistency is what made the letter, when it finally appeared on the table, impossible to dismiss as theatre. Nobody in that room believed even for a second that it was a prop. The second leader to react was a woman whose government had for years maintained one of the strictest immigration postures among the 12. She did not reach for the letter. She sat with her hands folded, watching him, and when she finally spoke, her voice was carefully measured, testing him rather than confronting him. With respect. "Holy Father," she said, "a letter is not a policy. Empathy does not build infrastructure. It does not staff a camp or fund a shelter." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected the question, as if he welcomed it rather than resented it. "You are right," he said. "A letter builds nothing. But I did not bring you a letter to build something for you. I brought it so that whatever you build next, you build it." Having heard her voice first, and not only the numbers on a briefing slide. Numbers do not keep anyone up at night. Voices do. He let that settle before continuing his tone, never rising, never sharpening into confrontation. "I am not asking you to abandon strategy. Nations require strategy. I understand this better than people assume. I am asking only that strategy be built on top of memory and not in place of it. A policy written without ever hearing the person it is meant to help is a policy built on a guess, and guesses, however well-intentioned, tend to fail the very people they claim to serve." A murmur moved through the room, not disagreement. Something closer to recognition. Several of the 12, according to witnesses seated along the far wall, exchanged glances. The particular kind of glance shared by people who have just heard something they cannot easily argue with and are uncomfortable admitting it. It was here that the re-engagement turn came the moment, as aides described it later, when the meeting shifted from a diplomatic courtesy into something none of the 12 had planned for. Because the Pope was not finished. He reached again into the plain folder, and this time he drew out not a letter, but a small object wrapped in a square of cloth. He unwrapped it slowly and set it on the table beside the letter. It was a child's shoe. Small, worn through at the toe, one lace missing entirely. This belonged to the boy the woman wrote about, he said. He did not survive that winter. I was given this shoe by the sister who runs the shelter where the mother eventually found safety 3 years after the letter was written. 3 years after she made her promise. I have carried it with me since. Not as a trophy of grief, I would never do that to her memory, but as a reminder each time I sit in a room like this one, that the decisions made here do not stay on paper. They arrive eventually at the feet of a child, sometimes too late. Nobody in the room spoke for nearly a full minute. It is worth pausing on this moment specifically, because it is the one that later dominated every account, every leaked description, every whispered retelling in press rooms afterward. Not the letter, not the diplomatic language, but a small worn shoe set, gently on a conference table between 12 of the most powerful people alive. One aide who witnessed it firsthand described the room afterward as structurally the same, spiritually a different place. A translator normally trained to remain entirely neutral, later admitted she had to stop mid-sentence and compose herself before continuing. The Pope did not raise his voice once during the entire encounter. He did not need to. Those close to him have long said that his greatest instrument was never volume, it was stillness. A stillness so complete it forced everyone around him to quiet down simply to remain in the same room as it. He does not fill silence, one long-time aide said. He lets silence do the work he could never do with a raised voice. People mistake gentleness for weakness. It is the opposite. Gentleness held with total conviction is the hardest thing in the world to argue against, because there is nothing to push against. It does not resist you, it simply remains. By the time the third leader spoke, a man representing one of the summit's wealthier nations, a man known for blunt, transactional negotiating, the tone in the room had already shifted from posture to something closer to reckoning. "What do you want from us specifically?" he asked. Not unkindly, but directly the way a man asks, when he has run out of patience for symbolism and wants an actionable outcome. The Pope's answer when it came surprised almost everyone in the room because it was smaller than anyone expected. "I do not want a treaty today," he said. "I do not want 12 signatures on a document that will take months to draft and years to enforce. I want one thing only, and it costs nothing. And it can be done before any of you leave this building." He paused. "I want each of you to carry that shoe in your mind into the next meeting where this subject is discussed without me present. That is all. Not a policy. A memory. Memories change rooms more permanently than mandates do, because mandates can be repealed and memories cannot." It was in the truest sense the single quotable line the entire encounter had been building toward the line that would circulate through newsrooms, through sermons, through classrooms, discussing the moment for years afterward. Memories change rooms more permanently than mandates do. Within 6 minutes of the shoe being placed on the table, the formal agenda of the summit, the trade discussions, the border negotiations, the carefully worded joint statement, drafted days in advance by staff on all sides, was set aside. Not cancelled, set aside. The 12 leaders spent the remainder of the session doing something none of their schedules had allotted time for. They listened. They asked the Pope questions, not about doctrine, but about the woman who wrote the letter about the shelter where she now lived, about what specifically had been missing from the aid already being sent to camps like hers. He answered every question plainly, admitting, when he did not know something, refusing to pretend expertise he did not have. "I am not an engineer," he said at one point. When asked about infrastructure specifics, he could not speak to. "I cannot tell you how to build a road or wire a shelter for electricity. I can only tell you what it feels like to stand in the mud beside someone who has neither, and to watch her explain to her son why the promise she made him has to wait one more winter." By the end of the session, no formal agreement had been signed, a detail some later criticised. Arguing the summit had produced spectacle without substance, but within the following 3 weeks, 7 of the 12 nations represented in that room independently announced new funding commitments to refugee shelter infrastructure, 3 of them specifically citing the summit as the reason for accelerating decisions that had been stalled in committee for over a year. None of the formal announcements mentioned the shoe. All of them, in private briefings later leaked to journalists, referenced it directly. It's worth slowing down again here, because the temptation in telling a story like this is to treat the summit itself as the climax, the dramatic centre of the whole account. It was not. The true centre of this story is not what happened in that glass-walled room at all. It is what happened 3 years earlier in a shelter run by a handful of exhausted volunteers, when a grieving mother handed a stranger her son's shoe and asked for nothing in return, except that someone somewhere remember that he had existed. That is the moment the entire summit was built to honour. Every letter, every silence, every leader who reached across a table to hold a piece of paper, with visible care, all of it existed only because 3 years earlier, one woman refused to let her son become a statistic, and one man months later refused to let her voice disappear into a filing cabinet of forgotten correspondence. This is in the end what people mean when they describe this Pope's greatest strength as something almost impossible to name in political terms. It is not charisma, though he has it. It is not intellect, though few who meet him leave unimpressed by it. It is fidelity, an almost stubborn refusal to let the smallest, most powerless voice in any room go unheard, even when that room contains the 12 most powerful people on earth, even when honouring that voice means setting aside an entire prepared agenda in favour of 6 minutes of silence and a worn child's shoe. In the days that followed, a strange thing happened in newsrooms that had spent years struggling to make faith-based stories land with a wider audience. The footage of the summit itself was minimal. A few seconds of the 12 leaders arriving a single photograph of the Pope walking through the side entrance past the folded catering table. There was no footage of the letter being read, no recording of the shoe being unwrapped from its square of cloth. And yet the story spread faster than almost any other that month, carried not by images, but by the accounts of people who had been in the room and could not stop describing what they had witnessed. A junior translator, 26 years old, gave the first detailed public account in a short post she almost did not publish, worried it revealed too much about a closed-door meeting. She described the specific sound the room made when the shoe was set down. Not silence exactly, she wrote, but the sound of 12 people simultaneously forgetting to breathe. She described watching the sharp-tongued negotiator, the one famous for walking out of prior summits, reach for a handkerchief he clearly hadn't planned on needing. Her account was shared, translated and reposted across a dozen languages within 2 days, each version adding small details from other witnesses until a fuller picture began to emerge of a room that had for 6 minutes stopped behaving like a room full of politicians and started behaving like a room full of people. It's worth pausing here to understand why this single encounter carried the weight it did, because the Pope had by that point in his life already been tested by rooms far more hostile than a glass-walled summit hall. Years before his election, during a period of civil unrest in a region he had been sent to oversee, he had walked unarmed and unescorted into a checkpoint, controlled by an armed faction that had only days earlier fired on a convoy of aid workers. He carried nothing with him but a small wooden cross and a list handwritten of the names of 11 children still trapped behind the checkpoint line. He did not demand their release. He asked quietly whether the men holding the checkpoint had children of their own, and he waited in the open in the sun for nearly 3 hours while they decided how to answer him. The children were released before nightfall. He never spoke publicly about what was said during those 3 hours, and the 2 colleagues who eventually convinced him to discuss it, decades later, described him waving off the question with visible discomfort, insisting the story wasn't his to tell. It belonged, he said to the mothers waiting on the other side of that line, and to the men who chose in the end to let their own humanity outweigh whatever orders they had been given. That pattern, asking rather than demanding, waiting rather than forcing listening, long past the point most people would have given up, followed him through every escalation he was ever asked to help diffuse. Diplomats who worked alongside him in later years described a man almost allergic to ultimatums, a man who believed with what some considered naive stubbornness, and others considered the only real courage left in modern diplomacy, that no negotiation was ever truly lost until both sides had stopped listening to each other entirely. He used to say that anger has a battery, one former colleague recalled. It runs down eventually on its own if you don't feed it. Most negotiators try to out-argue anger. He simply outlasted it. He would sit across from men who hated everything he represented, and he would simply remain quiet and unmoved until the anger burned itself out and something more honest was left underneath it. That same patience was on full display in the 6 minutes that reshaped the summit, though almost nobody watching from outside the building understood at the time that they were witnessing a technique this man had spent an entire lifetime refining. It looked to the cameras stationed outside like nothing at all had happened. No handshake photograph, no joint statement read aloud on the steps. Just 12 exhausted-looking leaders exiting a side door hours later than scheduled, several of them visibly quieter than when they had arrived. There is a story less widely reported, but confirmed independently by 2 people present, from the hours immediately after the summit ended. As delegations filed out, exchanging the practiced pleasantries of departing dignitaries, the Pope remained behind. He did not join the closing photographs. He sat alone at the table for several minutes, the letter and the shoe still resting where he had placed them. And when a young aide asked gently if he was ready to leave, he answered with something that aide has repeated many times since in interviews and homilies, of her own in quiet conversations with friends, trying to understand what she witnessed that day. "I am always ready to leave a room," he told her. "What I am never ready to do is leave a person behind in it." That sentence, more than the letter, more than the shoe, more than the 6 minutes of silence that supposedly rattled 12 governments, is the truest description of what people have started calling his secret weapon. It was never a strategy. It was never leverage in the way the word is normally used. It was a discipline practiced quietly for decades before the world was watching, of refusing to let power distract him from the people power is meant to serve. World leaders in the weeks that followed gave careful, measured statements about the summit statements crafted by press officers, statements that spoke of dialogue and cooperation and shared commitment. But in private, according to multiple accounts that eventually made their way into print, more than one leader admitted something closer to the truth. That they had walked into that glass-walled room prepared to negotiate with an institution, and they had walked out having been quietly, irreversibly confronted by a conscience. Whether that confrontation produces lasting change remains as it always does. An open question. One that depends not on a single meeting, however extraordinary, but on what those 12 leaders choose to remember the next time a decision crosses their desk that will never make headlines, the next time a policy is drafted in a room where no letter arrives to interrupt it, the next time the easiest thing to do is forget. But for those in the room that day, something had already shifted, and it did not require a signature to be real. A stillness had entered a place built for argument, and it had not left when the delegations did. Perhaps that is the only kind of weapon that has ever truly changed anything, not force and not fear, but the unbearable, undeniable weight of being asked gently and without flinching to remember someone the world had almost let itself forget. Historians of the papacy, in the months after the summit, struggled to categorise what had actually taken place because it fit none of the usual frameworks used to measure a pope's influence. It was not a doctrinal statement. It was not a canonised teaching, nor a formal encyclical, nor even an official address recorded and archived in the ordinary way. It was in the truest sense an act witnessed by exactly 12 people and a handful of aides retold second-hand to a world that never saw the footage and never would. And yet its influence proved in the end more durable than many formal declarations issued with far greater ceremony. One of the 12 leaders present speaking many months later at an unrelated public event was asked by a reporter whether the shoe on the table had truly changed her thinking or whether it had simply made for a compelling story afterward. She paused for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her answer surprised the room. "I have sat through hundreds of briefings in my career," she said. "I could not tell you the specific numbers from most of them a week later. I could not forget that shoe if I tried. That is not sentiment. That is simply how memory works. We do not remember statistics. We remember the particular." He understood that better than any strategist I have ever worked with, and he never once tried to strategize at all. He only refused to let a person become a number. That refusal, small, quiet, endlessly repeated across decades of a life spent choosing presence over performance, is in the end the entire story. Not a summit, not a shoe, not even the letter itself, remarkable as it was. The story is a habit practiced so consistently over so many years that by the time the world finally noticed it, it had already reshaped a room full of the most powerful people alive without raising its voice even once. Love, he has said many times in many rooms, far quieter than that one, is the only force that has ever actually changed anything permanent in this world. Everything else is temporary. Love is the only thing anyone has ever built that outlasts the room it was spoken in. For more reflections on faith, courage, and the moments the headlines rush past, consider staying close to this channel, and if a particular line in this story stayed with you, share it in the comments below.